And welcome back to the conversation. It's Adrienne Lawrence, and I have more very interesting news for you. And this time, joining me is Matt Cantor. That's the Guardian's copy editor. Thanks so much for joining us, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Adrienne.
Yes, so 2022, it is about to be in the books. And speaking kind of books and words, well, I know there have been a lot of words out there that popped up this year that seem to have really kind of given 2022 its exclamation point, whether it's quiet quitting or, as you've noted with your article, goblin mode. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of them seem to have to do with work in some way. It felt like kind of the most prominent ones that we noticed at the Guardian were goblin mode, which is this idea of sort of it was Oxford's word of the year. It's sort of about abandoning all pretense of respectability and just living according to like your foulest instincts, which might mean like lying in bed, eating Cheetos all day and watching Netflix, throwing your trash on the floor, that kind of thing. And then so that was sort of like the rebellion against like an Instagram curated lifestyle. And then the sort of like work counterpart to that was quiet quitting, which refers to kind of like doing the bare minimum at work, which was coined, I think, by a career coach who was criticizing hustle culture. And that one also turned up in a lot of sort of end of year word lists. I think it's probably sort of a sort of like, well, I hesitate to say post-pandemic because we're still in a pandemic, but sort of post the worst of the pandemic, realization that maybe people don't want to let work define them as much as it had, in 2019.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because I was just going to make that observation. I think with the pandemic making us realize that we are not infallible, that all sorts of nonsense is completely and totally not within our control. And so why not just live according to your own terms and value what you value? And that seems to be somewhat reflected with these terms, eh?
Yeah, definitely. And one of my colleagues, another Guardian writer, Tayo Barrow, was pointing out that this idea of quiet quitting sort of has been framed as like this rebellion, but in a way, like it shouldn't be the norm to have to do more than what your job description entails. All this extra work is it's also often put on women, and particularly women of color, doing what she describes in her piece as the office housework, which is sort of like daily tasks that need doing but don't get you noticed by the higher ups, like organizing workplace social events and stuff like that. So I think her piece maybe sort of reframed the idea of quiet quitting to me as something that we should all probably just be doing.
Yeah, and it also seems to go within the broader framework, because something that I noticed coming out of the pandemic, even though it feels like it was just yesterday, even though we're still in it, but is we're seeing a lot of unionization and people standing up and pushing back against these major corporations or companies and ensuring that their needs are taken care of. And so with quiet quitting also being within that framework of not feeling abused or taken advantage of. But it's sad because quiet quitting has it has a negative connotation as opposed to, I'm just not gonna do the work that I'm not getting paid for. And I'm good with that. And right. How that could just be doing my job.
Exactly. Like another way to phrase it would just be doing your job. It's we have the word quitting in it, but it doesn't. It's just a reaction to a culture that I think calls on us to do more than what we actually are expected to do.
Exactly. And it would be nice if a lot of these employers kind of got it together in terms of recognizing that all of the efforts people are putting in, even when it comes to providing emotional support and emotional labor in the workplace, that we're not being compensated for it. And that it is something that is detracting from us having enriching lives elsewhere. So not doing it anymore is completely and totally acceptable. And if you want people to do more, pay them.
Yes.
But also, I really do love goblin mode, not just because I am in my personal just sloth mode right now in between the two holidays and just wanting to enjoy as much TV and comfort food as possible. But I like how you frame this as kind of just the juxtaposition to this cultivated Instagram perfection lifestyle.
Yeah, I think it's kind of an escape from that, and it's really appealing for that reason. I think another thing a few people have pointed out, this is not by any means my original idea, but that app Be Real that was out this year that a lot of people were sort of it was a sort of a reaction against this like perfect life and trying to cast yourself as more of a as an authentic person. And maybe that does involve lying in bed and just scrolling through Instagram all day. But there's nothing wrong with that. So I like the idea that the term is sort of allowing us to recognize and embrace that behavior that we all do behind closed doors.
Absolutely, and maybe even encourage more people not to feel that they have to maintain this idealistic portrayal of their lives, as opposed to just being more authentic in every space. And so, in terms of your work with 2022 and looking back, what else did you notice?
Well, there were a few. So those felt like the words that were sort of the most prominent that were talked about sort of all over the media, but there were a lot of little words that I think sort of slipped under the radar this year that I thought were interesting. It's the sort of polar opposite of quiet quitting was Elon Musk's telling Twitter employees that they needed to be, quote, extremely hardcore, which was something that he put in an office memo. Not exactly clear what that means, but it seems like it sort of is about expecting your life to revolve around work. Probably has something to do with the fact that beds were apparently turning up in Twitter offices. And it also just makes you wonder, like, wasn't Twitter, well, obviously people's behavior on it has always been despicable, but on the other hand, like from a technological perspective, it seems like it's always been fine. So I'm not really sure why he felt like people weren't being extremely hardcore enough in the first place. But it was just an interesting juxtaposition with those other two phrases we just talked about.
Absolutely, and I understand that Silicon Valley, the execs there are trying to make a push to essentially take away small benefits people have that they've been providing, because it's a thought that people have gotten too comfortable, where I don't necessarily think that's the case, as much as a lot of these higher ups want individuals to bend the knee. They want to have that feeling of superiority, as though I'm dangling your future and your livelihood in my hands, and so I want you to jump. And so that it just seems very twisted, like a response or a return to some kind of feudal system in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And on the sort of lighter end, there are a few words that I have not heard anyone else point out as being all over the place this year, but like as a copy editor, they were just everywhere. One was the word about. This is super nerdy, but I'm going to say it anyway. Has kind of turned into like around. So people have stopped saying. Something you might say like the discussion about the return to the office has become the discussion around the return to the office, which to me, I think is sort of like this performative thing that makes the word about seem kind of smarter. Like if you say, I have concerns around mental health, that sounds sort of more thoughtful than concerns about mental health. That was something that came up a lot. And also, sort of going hand in hand with that is that the phrase or the word discussion has kind of become discourse, even when they're talking about like, Harry Styles supposedly spitting on Chris Pine. We now have like discourse about that instead of just saying we're posting about it. We're having a discourse about it. It's a discourse about masculinity and saliva production or something like that. If you talk about the discourse on Twitter, it's just a way of signaling that you're in the conversation. You're a real Twitter expert.
It sounds more highbrow as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly.
Perfectly fine. The whole about around thing, as far as I'm concerned, our society is not necessarily as direct as it should be. And so instead of just saying, I want to talk about something and using that around kind of thing, it almost plays into that, well, let me avoid an issue in terms of my directness. And I'm going to more, tiptoe around it.
Yeah, I mean that's totally right, and I hadn't totally thought of it that way. That's a really great point. Yeah, because I had thought about how talking around a subject has its a very specific meaning. It means you're skipping it. You're not quite touching on the subject itself. So yeah, but I hadn't thought of it the way you put it well. In terms of sort of a way of our culture ducking subjects. Yeah, it's very useful in that way. It's sort of a very vague term.
And probably makes people feel a lot more secure, especially because they don't want to be as direct as they should be. But I have my own issues with that. In terms of 2023 and what could be on the cusp of things that you have seen more toward the end of 2022 that could hop on over, or other things that you're like, oh, I really foresee this showing up.
Yeah. Well, another one that has come up just at the end, speaking of the pandemic, is this triple-demic that's going on right now with sort of like COVID was insulted that we weren't paying any attention to it this year. So now it's brought like two of its little respiratory virus buddies, the flu and RSV. So we've got like three viruses going around. So who knows, like by the end of next year, is it going to be a quadruple-demic? I mean, I hope not. And another one that I really liked this year was when Serena Williams sort of semi-retired from tennis. She said that she was evolving away from it, which is, I always get annoyed when celebrities say they're going to retire from something because they never do. You know, you had like Tom Brady retiring and then coming back 40 days later.
Although retired from his marriage, but
yeah, that too. Yep. And I mean, people do this all the time. Celebrities, you know, they're kind of freelancers, right? So they don't really have to retire. So I like the word evolving, and I wonder if more celebrities, like speaking of 2023, are going to start using that as a way to say, like, I'm distancing myself from it, but that doesn't mean I'm never going to do another movie or never play another tournament, you know?
Yeah, and I like that too. I agree that does sound less final because it does get annoying when they're like, I'm out, and then all of a sudden they're like, I'm back. And so, but I also think it's less offensive than words like uncoupling.
Yes. Yeah, it's not as infuriating as uncoupling for sure.
Seriously. Well, I really want to thank you so much for enlightening us to all the words that you came across in your work, which I find to be extremely fascinating, especially watching, people's discourse seem to evolve in various ways. So Matt, if people want to follow your work, where can they find you on social media?
I'm on Twitter at Cantor Matthew, Cantor Matthew. That's my main sort of social media handle.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. That's Matt Cantor, The Guardian copy editor.
Thank you so much for having me.